forward to. It frankly has been hard to watch and listen to the news every day without asking why. And now I think we have a person who may be able to give us some answers. Bill Gibbons is a friend. He is also a neighbor of our Midtown Memphis Rotary Club. And he has a tremendous background in the criminal justice field and law enforcement. Now, I'm just going to summarize a couple of things. You have seen his full biography, but I think it is appropriate that we say and mention a couple of things. First of all, he's a law graduate of Vanderbilt University. He's been a lawyer in private practice. He has served 2 governors on a full-time basis, Governor Alexander and Governor Haslam. He was the Attorney General of Shelby County for, I believe, over 15 years. He was the Commissioner of the Department of Safety and Homeland Security for 5 years. And for the last 5 years, he has occupied 2 jobs. One as president of the Memphis Shelby Crime Commission, and the second for the University of Memphis as the executive director of Public Safety Institute for the University of Memphis. It is a real, and I should say, I suppose that as a lawyer, he comes home every night and has to talk to a judge because he's married to Julia, who is a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit. So it's a real pleasure, Bill Gibbons, for you to be with us, and we welcome your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Al. I have to say that being married to a judge, I know who has the last say in all matters at home. And I show due respect. When Al contacted me about this, he mentioned, I don't know, 6 or 7 possible topics, and that's impossible for me to cover. I'm a former Rotarian, so I understand the importance of staying within the time frame. So I'm going to try to spend about 20 minutes talking about a couple of things, and then take any questions that you might have. The primary thing I want to focus on tonight is our violent crime challenge. If I have time, I'll touch on a little bit about the issue of police misconduct. But again, I'm glad to take any questions on any areas that you may have. Let me spend just a minute telling you what the Crime Commission is and the Public Safety Institute is, because I don't want to assume that you know. I will say that the Crime Commission has a great website at memphiscrime.org, and I would urge you to take a look at that. But basically, the Crime Commission is a nonprofit corporation. It's been around since 1996. For those of you who are old enough to remember, like Al and me, 1996 was a very, very tough year crime-wise. Mayor Harrington and others came together trying to figure out what to do. And one idea they came up with was to create the Crime Commission, really with the mission of identifying and promoting and advocating best practices to reduce our crime rate. So that was the whole idea back in 1996, and that's what we've been at ever since. Beginning in 2007, we began taking those best practices that had been identified, and rather than looking at them in terms of silos, decided to put them within the umbrella of a common community plan, and that's called the Safe Community Plan. I really don't consider it a Crime Commission plan because it's developed with input from hundreds of people. Maybe some of you who are part of this tonight have participated in that. Judge Childers, I think you've participated some in the past. But beginning in 2007, the Crime Commission began to help develop a 5-year Safe Community Plan. We are now in the 3rd 5-year plan. And again, it's composed of best practices, some of which we have already applied here in the city of Memphis, and some of which we've stolen from other cities, have not yet applied here. If you want to take a look at the details of that plan, again, you can go into the website, and I think it's got a good summary of it. Public Safety Institute at the University of Memphis really is kind of the research arm and really kind of digs into assessing what's working and what's not. And if something's not working, is it because maybe it was actually a bad idea, or is it because it's not being implemented properly? About half of what we do at the Public Safety Institute relates to the Safe Community Plan and assessing what's working and what's not. But we also have, I believe, 7 grants at this point to do other research related to public safety. It's an example, we're in the middle, about to finish an evaluation of our mental health court. We also just finished up some research on services available to ex-offenders as they return to the community. So we do some things outside the scope of the Safe Community Plan as well. So I just wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about those 2 entities. Let me talk a little bit about where we are in terms of crime trends. I don't want to bore you too much with too much data, although we are very data driven and we really crunch the numbers a lot. So kind of bear with me on this. First of all, I think when you look at this, it's pretty safe to say that the pandemic has had an impact on crime figures over the last 3 months or 4 months in particular. And let me kind of dig a little bit into that. First of all, in terms of major violent crime, and when I say major violent crime, I'm talking about murders, robberies, rapes, and aggravated assaults. Those are the 4 categories. We use that because that's what the FBI uses to define major violent crime. So we use the same definition. And when you look at that, what we have seen over the last 3 months in particular is a real spike in murders and aggravated assaults. The first 3 months of the year, violent crime was actually down compared to last year. But now, 6 months into this year, violent crime is actually up compared to last year. And it's the murders and the aggravated assaults that are really kind of driving that. When you think about those 2 categories of violent crime, usually the victim and the perpetrator know each other. So there's something going on there. And I think arguably it is related to the pandemic. Our normal routines have been disrupted. Our normal family routines have changed. Many citizens are without jobs. All of that is probably adding to a stress level for a lot of people. And in particular, individuals who may already have a short fuse probably have an even shorter fuse right now. So I do think there's probably some relationship to COVID-19 and the pandemic and the increase we're seeing in aggravated robberies and murders. And by the way, those 2 things are related because it only takes a split second for an aggravated robbery, I think, aggravated assault. It only takes a second for an aggravated assault to turn into a murder. So there is a relationship there. At the same time, we have actually seen a reduction in reported robberies. That usually involves perpetrators who do not know the victim. So I guess there's some comfort in that. Robberies are down about 10% compared to last year. So maybe random acts of violence are actually going down. So I guess that's encouraging. When you look at major property crime, auto thefts, burglaries, other felony thefts, down substantially compared to last year. And I think that's encouraging. The one area that is going up is auto thefts. There's some theories behind that. Burglaries are down very substantially, about 25% compared to last year. So that's very encouraging. And when you think about it, that makes sense during a pandemic because people are at home more. You're less apt to have vacant homes for people to break into. So when you think about it that way, it makes some sense that our home burglaries are down. Also, when you look at the overall crime, just all the crimes together, there are 56 different categories that we look at. Crime is down so far this year compared to last year, down about 4%. So that's encouraging as well. Now, going back to the violent crime, a lot of it is being driven by gun violence. And when you look at that in particular, there are there's some very, very disturbing trends. In terms of reported violent crime incidents involving guns, so far this year, we're up about 11% compared to last year. The Memphis Police Department measures incidents. So that's where we get the incident figure from the Memphis Police Department. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation measures offenses. So it's a little different. What's the difference? Well, one incident can include multiple offenses. So for example, if you have an aggravated assault with 4 victims, the TBI counts that as 4 offenses. You can also have an aggravated assault and a robbery. That counts as 2 offenses. So it gets a little confusing, but MPD measures incidents, TBI measures offenses. And so far this year, based on the TBI figures, offenses involving guns are up 23% compared to last year. In terms of shots fired, in terms of reports of shots fired, we're about even with last year. So far this year, about 870 individuals have been reported as actually being shot in the city of Memphis. When you look at weapon law violations, and when we're talking about weapon law violations, we're talking about felons in possession of firearms, people in possession of illegal firearms, such as sawed-off shotguns. We're up 113% compared to last year. When we talk about guns being stolen from vehicles, which is more and more of a problem, so far we're at about 500 this year of reported guns stolen from vehicles. So kind of looking ahead, it's probably going to be around 1,000 or so before the year's over. So I say all that to say that our violent crime problem is being driven in large part by gun violence. And it's a challenge that we got to get a handle on. I think Mayor Strickland is absolutely correct when he says that our major challenge as a community, aside from the current pandemic, obviously, but kind of putting that aside, our major challenge as a community is to get a handle on our violent crime problem. Because as the mayor has pointed out, it is the key to really making progress on a number of other fronts. Being a city where we are growing our jobs, having more and better jobs, growing our population, growing our tax base. He believes, and I agree with him, that the key to that is to reduce our violent crime rate. So what do we do about it? I mentioned earlier that the Crime Commission is advocating best practices. We kind of know what works. And let me mention 3 things and then be done and take some questions, I guess. First of all, there's been a lot of discussion about the number of police officers we need. Do we have enough? In the opinion of the Crime Commission, we do need more police officers. We're not sure of the number. There needs to be really an assessment of that. But when you look at where we are today compared to just a few years ago, you can see the difference. In 2011, we had almost 2,500 police officers in the city of Memphis. 2011 was the year when we had our lowest violent crime rate in recent memory. So there appeared to be some correlation between the number of police officers and our violent crime rate. That's just one side of the coin, though. It's not just the number of police officers, but also how you deploy those police officers. Are you deploying them in a smart way, in a data-driven way? So it's not just a matter of the number, but also making smart use of those police officers. So our peak was in 2011. We were being data-driven at that time. Many of you have heard the term Blue Crush, which is just a nice term for data-driven policing. So things looked pretty good in 2011. But between 2011 and 2017, we had a net loss of over 20% of the police force. So we went from roughly 2,500 to below 2,000 police officers, which meant that there were just fewer resources to deploy in a data-driven way. And what the city has ended up doing is spending over $25 million a year in overtime to try to have data-driven policing as best it can. But that's not a very good way of doing it. It's not something that is sustainable. That's a lot of money to spend on overtime just to try to have the coverage that you think you need. So Mayor Strickland is really committed to increasing the number of police officers. We have had a net increase in the last 2 years, in 2018 and 2019. At the end of 2019, we had 2,077 police officers. We've lost some in the first 6 months of this year. We're now down to, I believe, 2,052 police officers. This Thursday, we're graduating 54 new police officers from the training academy. So that number will go up. But it's a challenge. Again, I can't give you the exact number of what we need. We need an assessment of that. That assessment is in progress right now by the city. I would say it's going to be somewhere between 2,300 and 2,800, but I can't give you the number. It'll be interesting to see what that assessment shows. But again, the other part of it is to be data-driven in how you use those officers. It's not just a matter of numbers. A second really important best practice to use in tackling violent crime is what's called focused deterrence. You probably heard a little bit about that, and I have two props, two books that I will recommend to you. One is called Uneasy Peace. It's gotten some very good reviews. It's by a guy named Patrick Sharkey. So I recommend this book to you. You can get it through Novel. I promote Novel as opposed to Amazon. And another book you may have heard of called Bleeding Out by Thomas App. Both of these books really advocate the focused deterrent approach. And basically what it involves is identifying those individuals in the community who either, based on their own records, are directly responsible for a lot of our violent crime, or indirectly by the influence they have over others. An example would be a leader of a gang, for example. But identify those individuals and tell them the way it is through what's called a call-in. You bring them in, you have law enforcement there, but you also have some social service providers there. And basically the message is twofold. Number one, if you keep up your activity and continue to engage in violence, law enforcement and prosecutors are going to do everything they can to hold you accountable and get you off the streets. On the other hand, if you're willing to change your behavior and try to become a productive member of our community, we will help you out. We will help you find a job. We will help you get any additional education that you need, or housing, or whatever. And it's kind of a stick and carrot approach. We have started that in the city of Memphis on a very limited pilot basis. So far, we have had 2 call-ins with 18 individuals involved. So far, 13 of them are very much on track, which is encouraging. But we've got to grow it. We've got to expand it. And I don't know the magic number, but let's say it's 200 individuals out there in this community who are directly or indirectly responsible for a lot of our violent crime. And if we could grow focused deterrence to cover those, say, 200 individuals, I think it could have a very, very significant impact on our violent crime rate. District Attorney Wyrick, Director Rollins, and others are very committed to it. What it really involves is finding the resources in order to do that, because in order to do it, you got to be willing to follow up with those jobs and housing and education and all those components that go with it. But it's something that the Crime Commission is going to be pushing a lot in the coming months. It's a little difficult to have call-ins during a pandemic. Got to get beyond that. The third thing I would mention is the importance of our multi-agency gang unit and expanding it. A very large percentage of our violent crime is due to gang activity. And when I say that, it's not necessarily always gang related. In other words, it may not be a gang retaliation or and so on, although in some cases it is, but a large percentage of our violent crime is committed by identifiable gang members. So one thing that we have really focused on is expanding our gang unit and giving the resources that it needs. We've made a lot of progress on that. If you go back to 2016, there were 35 officers assigned to the multi-agency gang unit. We're now up to 62 officers. And they basically come from the Memphis Police Department, the Shelby County Sheriff's Office, and the ATF. So I mentioned those three things as practices that I think could make a very, very substantial difference in our violent crime rate. And we need to place priority on that. I don't know if I should go on and get into police misconduct or just kind of stop there and take questions, because I know Rotarians take a look at your watches and like to end on time. Al, do you want to talk about police misconduct a little bit or just take questions?
No, I think actually that was one of the questions that I know was going to come up about. I guess Mayor Strickland has indicated that he has already adopted, or the city has already adopted, what he calls the 8 can't wait rules, and he's mentioned those 2 or 3 times in some of his publications. But yes, I think it'd be a good idea for you to talk about that.
Okay, I'll consider that a question that I'm answering. Okay. First of all, part of the Safe Community Plan is to have better training of our police officers. And what we did without consultation with the police department or the sheriff's office, we did this independently, is identify 20 specific policies that we felt the Memphis Police Department and the sheriff's office ought to adopt in order to improve training and to improve performance by police officers. Most of those recommendations, policy recommendations, came from the 21st Century Policing Task Force that President Obama appointed. I believe about 17 out of the 20 recommendations came from that. All 20 recommendations come from what I would call credible sources. So we identified those, and we've basically scored the Memphis Police Department and the Shelby County Sheriff's Office on that. If you give us about a week, it'll be on our website, and you can take a look at that. But I will say in the case of MPD, they have implemented all 20. In the case of the Sheriff's Office, I believe they've implemented 16 and are thinking about the other 4. I may be a little off on that. But that's just what we've done. But in terms of police conduct, let me just make a couple of observations. First of all, as district attorney and then as commissioner of safety and homeland security overseeing our state troopers, I've had some contact with police misconduct. I will say that most of our police officers are very good, dedicated public servants. But just like any group, whether it's doctors or lawyers or ministers or teachers, there are some bad actors among police. And when we identify those bad actors, we need to hold them accountable. It's especially serious when we have bad actors among police because we have given them a gun and a badge and the power that goes with that. I will say that both as DA and Commissioner of Safety and Homeland Security, I found that it is in a lot of ways more difficult to hold police officers who have stepped across the line and engaged in misconduct than maybe the public realizes. I'm probably getting a little deep in the weeds here, but I guess it's kind of interesting. As DA, I had many occasions to prosecute police officers who had crossed the line and engaged in what we allege to be criminal conduct. I remember a case involving police officers in the city of Millington. We thought we had a good case. The jury came back with a not guilty verdict. We had an occasion to prosecute some West Memphis police officers in what I thought was a horrendous chase across the Mississippi River Bridge. They ended up firing, I don't know, probably 100 bullets into this car once it crossed the bridge and crashed in Memphis. We prosecuted those police officers. They actually agreed to plead guilty to reckless homicide. But then under our state law, Judge Childers, they sought diversion, which meant that their records would be wiped clean and they could probably continue to serve as police officers. I opposed diversion, and I did what I thought at the time was a good job of following our statute to set forth all the reasons we opposed diversion. Our state Supreme Court, it went all the way up to our state Supreme Court, and our state Supreme Court mandated that I place them on diversion. I did not like that decision by our state Supreme Court, but they had the last say. General Wyrick, a couple of years ago, as you recall, proposed to the grand jury that a police officer be indicted over the shooting of an individual. The grand jury refused to indict. So I cite those three examples to say that it's not always as easy as some in the public may feel, even when you think you have a good case. As Commissioner of Safety and Homeland Security, I had many occasions, unfortunately, to have to discipline state troopers. In some cases, it was administrative actions. In some cases, it was termination. But we had a state civil service system under which they could appeal any decision for disciplining. And those civil service proceedings would sometimes take a year or more. And in many occasions, our decisions would be overturned. So I just point that out to say it's not as easy as some may think. I think the real solution moving forward is to eliminate the chances of having bad actors as police officers. And I think there are kind of two parts of that. Number one is doing a good job of recruiting the right kinds of people to be police officers. And that takes a lot of vetting and takes a lot of effort, but I think it's important on the front end to try to hire the best people. People who want to be true public servants, not people who are obsessed with having a gun and a badge and the power that goes with it. And again, that takes a lot of vetting. Frankly, in the age of social media, it kind of helps because you'll be amazed at what you can find out on social media in terms of applicants to be police officers and what they're motivated by. And then it requires a very intensive training, in particular training on those areas that involve interactions between the police and the public, whether it's use of force, stop and frisk, whatever it is, really trying to have good training on that and consistent training year after year for our police officers. So that's a long answer to your question now, but it's a big issue. And I've given you my thoughts, probably more than you wanted.
No, actually, I think it was good that you got into the Civil Service Board because that's one of the things that Mayor Strickland has been complaining about and also has wanted to make a real effort to restructure. So I think it was good to spend some time talking about that. The other thing that I wanted to ask before we turn it over to the rest of the club And I wanted to compliment you on the article that you wrote for the Daily Memphian on how to make Memphis safer from gun violence. You cited the 2 books that you've told us about as well. But the thing that I guess is not in that article that you have been very outspoken about has been the efforts of the legislature to create more gun handlers and not less. And since you've testified about that, maybe you could comment about that effort.
I'm glad you brought that up. And of course, I couldn't say everything in that column that you mentioned. There'll be a column on that another day, probably. But in its wisdom or lack thereof, back in 2014, I believe, the General Assembly enacted legislation providing that you do not have to have a handgun carry permit to carry a handgun in a car. I mentioned earlier the increase in guns stolen from cars. That was a predictable consequence of what the General Assembly did. We all know that we've had an increase in road rage incidents on our interstates as well as our city streets. That's a predictable result of what the General Assembly did. Now, there are some in the General Assembly who want to go the next step and propose that you can carry a handgun either concealed or openly without a permit and without any training and without any background check. Director Rawlings and I both appeared before the General Assembly this year to speak against that. We think it would be very, very harmful to our community. Luckily, the General Assembly, I guess if there's a silver lining to the pandemic, they decided to kind of punt a lot of legislation until next year. So they did not act on it this year, but it will be back next year. And I think it's very, very important that the public speak out about it and talk about the consequences. And let me mention 2 consequences. First of all, just in terms of the average citizen out there, don't we want that average citizen to have some training and to have a background check before openly carrying a handgun? I think we do. But beyond that, think about this. And I don't think a lot of our legislators have thought about this. We have a serious gang problem in Memphis. Some of those gang members are convicted felons and are not supposed to carry guns, although we realize some do, is reflected by the large number of felons in possession that are being prosecuted. But what it means is that for that gang member who does not have a felony conviction, that gang member can walk through the neighborhoods of our city and openly carry a handgun, and there's nothing the police can do about it except wave and say, have a good day. So that's where we are. And think about the intimidation that can occur in many of our neighborhoods as a result of that. Again, I don't think some of our legislators have totally thought that out, but I think it is a very, very serious consequence of enacting that kind of legislation. So I think we need to mobilize and make sure that that legislation is defeated next year, because it will come up again.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I know that I've seen on the chat board that Denise had a question, so maybe I'll turn to her and let her ask that question.
Well, you know, I guess a lot of us look back, and so many people, the whole idea of make America great again means sort of like make it to the 1950s for some. But, you know, it used to be that, at least in an idealized world, we have police who are able to become part of a regular neighborhood, that they would be assigned to the same area, that they'd have training, and that the police were not always somebody to fear horribly, but rather someone that you were just glad they were there to call in the event that something is needed and is wrong. Is this sort of leave it to Beaver idea just totally impossible in the future if you had a lot more funding and a lot more training of police so that they can not necessarily use military force and brute force to change behavior, but rather their wits and their relationships with people, and actually the neighborhood supporting them so that they're not out there all by themselves coming into a strange neighborhood, lonely in one car?
My answer is yes, I do think it's possible. You know, can we go back to the 1950s and leave it to Beaver? Maybe not. Just because we have a much higher level of violence now with a lot of individuals carrying weapons that are pretty serious in nature. But having said that, yes, I do think we can take some steps to really encourage police officers to develop good relationships with the communities that they serve. And frankly, to some degree, it takes, it's a resource problem in terms of number of police officers, because right now, if you ask most police officers, they're spending most of their time responding to incidents and really don't have as much time as they might like to get out and just talk in the community and get to know people. So to some degree, it's probably a resource problem. But I also agree with you that it's a training problem or training challenge. I guess that's a better way of putting it. And really doing the things necessary to help officers understand the importance of communicating with citizens and being the guardians of those citizens, not viewing the citizens as an enemy or anything, but viewing citizens as people with whom they want to work on a day-to-day basis. Again, it's a little bit harder given the violent crime rate that we have and so on, but I think that effort needs to be made. One thing the Memphis Police Department tries to do is work with citizens through such groups as neighborhood watch groups. And part of what the Crime Commission does is encourage that kind of citizen and law enforcement contact. But it needs to go beyond that, obviously. I think that's, a lot of the solution. I will say, Denise, that, and there's been some polling done on this, that the vast majority of Memphians want more of a police presence in their neighborhoods, not less. But with that additional presence, there needs to be more communication between officers and citizens of those neighborhoods as well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate, my little sister was a sergeant in the sheriff's department.
I remember that.
She said more than once that she was, quote, in the hood, and that people reached out to help her. They would warn her if she was stepping into a difficult situation. And sometimes she actually got injured and they would help her get out so that she could get some medical help. Yeah. So she was very appreciative. I mean, even if these people were doing petty crimes and that some of them were still pretty nice people.
Right, right.
So, Charlotte, I think you had a question.
I had a question, but I want to change it to a comment. I think that I think that the program that Judge Childress has, the mindfulness program, those 3 classes would be a great addition for police training. Because I've taken 2 and they've just made a real difference in my life. And I'd just like to nominate Judge Childress as the instructor for some police training.
Judge, tell us about what you do here.
Well, I've been teaching mindfulness in the law course for a number of years now, but we've offered a series. The second in the series was last week, and the last one in the 3-part series is August the 10th that the University of Memphis Alumni Association is offering. And I'll tell you, Charlotte, one of the things I learned, one of the comments after one of our sessions was the Germantown Police Department is actually training their officers with a mindfulness training course.
Wow,
So
that's great.
I was encouraged that at least one police department in Shelby County is offering that course. And so, yeah, it helps Bill teach everybody to use mindfulness and meditation to be more aware and teaching them how to respond in a more rational, calm manner rather than react under the heat of the moment kind of situation. And that's particularly helpful for law enforcement officers.
That's a great idea. Have you mentioned that to MPD or the Sheriff's Office?
I have not. I actually probably need to shoot an email to Mayor Strickland and let him point me to whoever I need to talk to offer that. Judge Steve Hornsby and I just did a Zoom webinar this morning for the Memphis Bar Association for their Ethics and Professionalism Committee. And so we teach quite a bit on mindfulness and meditation. So yeah, it's very helpful.
Do you mind if I kind of mention it to some folks in MPD?
No, I don't mind at all. If you want to suggest and have them contact me, and I'll get Judge Hornsby involved, and we'll try to work something up where we can offer the training course to anybody in law enforcement, fire department, whatever. People who run into very stressful situations, and that's the life of certainly a policeman or a sheriff's deputy.
Yeah.
That's what they deal with. I've got a question though that I wanted to pose, Al, if you don't mind, to Bill. The last several years, it's actually been more than the last 10 years, governments, both state and county, have been spending less and less on mental health treatment facilities. The mantra is no new taxes by some of our more conservative legislators, and I understand that as a taxpayer. I'm not being critical of that, but the problem is it's sacrificed the victim. In my judgment and my experience as a judge, the victim of those budget cuts it's leaned heavily on mental health treatment facilities. And so now what we got is our jails and prisons have now become our mental health quote unquote treatment centers, and our law enforcement officers have to be in the direct line of fire in treating mental health issues. And that's why, when you hear people talk about defunding the police, they're talking about shifting resources back to where they can be more effective and more useful, instead of housing our mental health patients in our jails and prisons where they really don't need to be because they cause untold number of problems in the jails and prisons. And Bill, I know you're aware of this. Is there any help? Is there any possibility, Bill, of getting through to our legislators to get them to understand what's happening? It's the old Benjamin Franklin saying, a penny wise and pound foolish.
I totally agree with you. Is there a possibility? Yeah, there's a possibility. I know that Governor Lee is actually looking at this issue a lot, and I don't want to, I'm going to predict that Governor Lee in the coming year or so is going to propose more funding for mental health in particular. I know it's an area that he's very concerned about, but you're absolutely right. And you and I are old enough to know back in the 60s and even in the 70s, when we were just institutionalizing everybody with mental health problems.
Yeah. And
so that was not a good situation. So everybody thought, well, we need to get away from institutionalizing everybody with any mental health problem, and we're going to provide these services at the community level for them. We're going to, instead of putting them in institution, we will provide kind of a safety net for them in the community, and that'll be better. The problem is that never happened. We talked about it. But instead of providing that level of services in the community, you're right, the jail became the alternative.
Right.
And that's where we are today. Now for those, and we need to change that. For those in the jail, I think Judge Skane is doing what he can, overseeing our mental health court to try to move in the right direction. But the answer is to try to address the problem before they ever get in the jail. You know, I'm glad that Judge Skane has stepped up and tried to do what he can once they're in the jail. But you're absolutely correct. You know, our jail has become our #1 mental health facility. It's very, very unfortunate.
There is a related question, and Valerie put it on the chat line, and it deals with domestic relations and how those matters are handled by the police, or maybe someone other than the police needs to be involved in those matters, since they are maybe becoming more prevalent. At least, as Valerie says, according to divorce actions filed.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. Police need more training when it gets to the issue of domestic relations and domestic violence. We do now have a new tool that law enforcement is hopefully using, and that's a lethality assessment tool that the police are supposed to use to kind of gauge the level of risk that a victim may encounter. I hope all the officers are using that. You know, the issue there is what follow-up is there as well. Once you identify a victim who is at high risk, what do you do about it? I know Judge Childers has spent a lot of time on this issue as well over the years. I didn't mention this earlier because I don't believe the figures. So far this year, domestic violence incidents are down by about 8%. I think that's misleading because, again, I think it's an example of the impact of the pandemic, because I think we have a lot of situations with the pandemic where the perpetrator and the victim are in the same home. The perpetrator is not leaving to go to the bar or anything because the bar is closed, and the victim doesn't have anywhere else to go. So the victim is not in a position to really call 911. So I think that reduction in domestic violence incidents is probably misleading, unfortunately. But I think the police can do a better job. Again, we do have this tool in place to try to measure the risk that a victim is at, which is helpful. Right now, to the Public Safety Institute, we are doing some pretty deep research on services available to victims of domestic violence. And we'll have our final report by the end of this year. I think what it's going to show is that we have some serious gaps in services to victims of domestic violence that we as a community need to address.
Let's see, Will, you had a question, and I can't see if anyone else has their hands up, but you can on your screen. So we have time for maybe one more question. But I'll have to turn it back over to you.
Sure. I may be a little bit in left field with this question, but at your state position, related to the recent national protests regarding police brutality and Black Lives Matter, there's been concern and I think even FBI investigation into the infiltration of our law enforcement departments by white supremacists. And I was curious if you were aware of any efforts at the state level to identify and prevent or root out the presence of white supremacists in our law enforcement officers in Tennessee.
I am not personally aware of that, But going back to something I said earlier, in terms of our recruitment process, you can find out a lot about people by checking their social media, a lot. And if someone has those views, in terms of new recruits, you can identify that on the front end pretty easily. In terms of existing officers, again, I'm not personally aware of any. I'm sure it's there. And we need to root it out and try to get rid of those bad actors. That's what I would call them. But it really, I did, when I was Commissioner of Safety and Homeland Security, I was amazed at some of the things people would put on social media who wanted to be state troopers. And in many cases, they involve racist views that you would find on their social media. So it really helped us to kind of weed out those individuals on the front end.
Well, Bill, this has been a fascinating discussion, and we really appreciate your participating with us. And we thank you very much for making the time. And we are going to do our best to support you and to support the Crime Commission, because I know that you need that kind of support. And I hope that maybe we can even talk some people into making a donation or two. I know you would appreciate that.
Because we do depend on private donations, by the way. And please go to our website, memphiscrime.org. It's got a lot of good information there. And within the next week or so, we will have the up-to-date half-year crime stats, all those crime stats on the website.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over to Charlotte, our president. Charlotte, are you there?
Here we go. I was muted. Thank you so much, Bill, for coming to speak to us today. We're very humbled and grateful, of course, energized in the information. One thing I would like to suggest is when you are aware of the mobilizing efforts for the gun carry issue, if there's something we can do, like write letters or whatever we could do, if you can make us aware of that, then that's something that I'm thinking maybe some members or maybe the whole club would be interested in participating in.
Very good. I'll make a note of that.
Thank you for the information. So with that, any questions or any other comments? Well, I would like to again thank everyone for joining us this evening. I think that we should start rephrasing our sessions. Instead of saying Rotary meeting, I think this is a university. It's like every meeting that we've had lately during the pandemic, we've learned what's like we got another university going. So we'll just refer to it now as the university. And thank you, Professor Gibbons.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Hope I'll see you at church sometime soon.
Yeah, sometime soon. Okay, is that it, Will? Want to sign us off?
Sure thing. I'll hang out here if anybody has any other questions, but if y'all want to go ahead and sign out from here, have a great night.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.